Hello everybody, welcome. I have just reattached my wind buffer to my wired Apple headset microphones, or microphone. It's not particularly windy, but I'm sort of pleased with the simple solution of wrapping a cotton ball around the mic and securing it with there's probably a formal name for these objects, but a bread wire, right? Those little wires that sometimes close the bread package. A lot of contrails in the sky today. I suppose there are people who suspect that every time they see a contrail, they're seeing chemtrails. Pretty sure most of those contrails are just vapor, caused by vapor. The engines heat the air, makes a vapor trail. There might be, occasionally in some places, some things that aren't contrails, but I strongly suspect that people who spent their lives watching aircraft and contrails would alert us. I know this is a very controversial topic that borders on the conspiratorial, but there are other strange problems like, I guess, maybe my objection isn't as strong as I once thought. This often turns out to be the case. But one of my simple objections was, if somebody's spreading some kind of chemistry in the atmosphere itself, and they're doing that on purpose, it's going to affect them and their children and their children's children and so forth. I suppose it could be that they don't have any children and they don't care. Oh, this is strange. This is the second bit of a carcass that I've seen today, and it's interesting because I almost never see bits of carcass and I walk here every day. Is it just that today I'm noticing what I don't notice? Or is today bit of carcass day? I just don't know. They're rather disgusting. Little chunks of fleshy, bloody gristle and fur and things. Certainly unappetizing. I don't necessarily have a plan for this talk today. We'll see where it goes. I was thinking about some things. Various kinds of magical intent. The transactional kind, where you trade something, often, or sometimes, this is apparently whatever is referred to by one's soul, for some boon or benefit in the short term. It seems like a wildly stupid idea to me. Hopefully I haven't accidentally done that myself. And the kind where you employ... Wow, what is that sound? Oh, it's a bird. Oh, it's a baby bird. It's a feed me sound. Huh. Okay. There are two fundamental principles of something resembling our idea of magic, which, let's face it, it's get or accomplish something without physically having to do the thing, or chase the thing or something like this. So in traditional Blackfoot knowledge, the language is problematical because what magic means in English is a broad array of things. Or actually, magic doesn't mean anything in any language. It's just a word. What actually happens with words is that we use them to mean things to each other in actual conversations, unless we're not having conversations and we're just saying things. And this becomes very confusing very quickly, because then the presumption that words have meanings begins to pervade. We have to interpret the gap. What gap? The gap of no relationship, no pre-existing context, random context, and so forth. There are ways in which that situation can become useful for us, but only if we deal with it very insightfully, intelligently. And what do I mean? I mean, the randomization of language is a kind of a paramagical substrate. And what am I trying to mean by magic? Well, I'm not trying to mean illusionists' tricks, fascinating though they are. And I'm not trying to mean the mere manipulation of the vulnerabilities in human thought and consciousness. I'm trying to mean something more like perhaps what people usually very naively mean with the word manifesting. An idea that I fundamentally mistrust, or maybe it's just the language that I mistrust, or maybe I'm ill-informed, which isn't as rare as I might like it to be. Yes, I'm not, as my listeners know, a big fan of The Secret or the various cults that derive their central premises from such ideas. At the same time, there is something to a kind of envisioning or dreaming of the future that is very powerful. The question is it as trivially silly? Like, what happens when you make that idea explicit is one of the questions. Because there's a fundamental difference between peripheral vision and foveal vision, between explicit identity and potential identities, right? And in that blur, there's something transcendentally momentous and powerful. But if we make the blur explicit, irony often results, meaning direct contradiction with stated purposes, goals, hopes, desires, intentions, cautions, and so forth. And so perhaps what actually bothers me about the manifesting cults is that they're taking something that I suspect properly belongs to the peripheral and making it foveal. Your foveal vision is the center vision. It's what you use when you look at something. Whereas your peripheral is what you use when you spread your gaze and take in the whole, right? And as some of you know, that if you gaze at the night sky, when you look at stars, you can see the stars visible to your foveal vision. When you look toward them, I'm getting a little wet there. If you spread your gaze, you will see stars that will literally disappear if you look at them. Right? And this is kind of what my concern is, as well as a sort of ideological trivialization of destiny, dreaming, visioneering. Yes, yes, yes. The scent of the herbs. Beautiful. So yeah, I'm getting somewhere near what sticks in my craw. And the weird thing about this problem for me is that by explicitly pointing at what sticks in my craw, this is part of the problem with thinking and part of the problem with language. Once I think I have a sense of what might be going on, I tend to become kind of clingy about that. And in that clinginess, well, it's not always conflicted, but it's often produces significant conflict. Yeah. Sage flower scent, yum. In Blackfoot, the two principles are similitude and contagion. And they mix together, they mate, they bond, they form very powerful abilities, you might call them, as well as faculties. I'm not going to lecture about that today. These two principles are also found in other magical traditions, such as voodoo, hoodoo, various witching ways. And perhaps also shamanism. Resemblance is a way to understand similitude. And similitude is a very sophisticated word that my friend Ryan Firstdiver uses. Contagion is fairly obvious. In a way, to refer to something directly in consciousness can often be a bit of a trap for us. Whereas to suggest it is much more powerful and, in a sense, magical, by which I mean transcendentally potent. Historically, women, females, are masters of indirect communication, suggestion, entrancement, which places consciousness into a sort of a flow state that can then be directed or shaped, or both, redirected, so forth. Yesterday at this spot, there was a young woman sitting on a log up above me, and she was practicing playing a particular kind of flute that appeared to be made of wood or possibly bamboo. I sat down, without gazing directly at her because, once again, explicit attention produces problems. Or, is occasionally appropriate. But usually if we're paying direct attention to something, it's often that we have the desire to capture, possess, or manipulate it. And nobody really wants to be captured, possessed, or manipulated. There's that explicitness in language again. Of course, sometimes we do. Or sometimes we partly want that. Or an aspect of us desires this while other aspects of us flee from it. This is the stormy cloud of what it's like to be human. I've made it to the high view. And there's that thing that looks a bit like Wardenclyffe Tower, but is actually the emergency public broadcasting speakers. The peripheral and the foveal. Dreaming consciousness largely corresponds to the former. Waking consciousness to the latter. Without being explicit, allow me to suggest that in the daytime, in bright sunlight, the sunlight declares the color and identity of objects and situations. What they are doing is obvious. It's explicit, relatively explicit. Whereas the moonlight, if it's there, or even the total darkness, in total darkness, it's pure suggestivity, right? You don't know where anything is. You can tap your way along the path with a stick if you're lucky, or skillful, or practice that. If you're very witchy, you can run in the darkness. I've never known someone who can do that. I can usually perambulate. I've heard of people who can run in pitch darkness, having practiced a kind of a non-ordinary sensing array that is natural to humans and animals, but rarely siren. A terrible noise. Dominates the entire oral sphere. Thankfully, most situations are highly temporary. The moonlight suggests rather than declares identities, and thus pareidolia. I need to look up exactly how to pronounce that word. But the imaginative experience of shapes and faces in, for example, the whirling bark of trees, or the texture of the surface of the trail, or the clump of bushes that just happens to be in a shape that looks like a raccoon and you can't at first tell it isn't. Right? So there's this dichotomy between suggestion and declaration that's very profound. And similarly in dreaming, because in dreaming, things, beings, and situations we may later decide, oh, that was my brother, that was our house, that was this, that was that. But in the actual dreaming experience, it's not really like that. A house that's quite different from mine can be my house. My sister can be a man. All kinds of strange amalgams of possible and actual form, identity, function, behavior ensue. Usually when those jays are making that noise, there's often a raptor nearby, but maybe not. It doesn't sound as chiding. It sounds more like,
yeah, I think so too.
Here I am, I'm over here. Although that looks like a raptor tree to me. That's Stellar's jay making the calls. See, there's that thing, right, of explicit categorical identity. So there are kinds of magic that don't really require trades, right? They're not transactional. And by magic in this case, I mean the curation of time, space, and relationships in the hope of producing the resemblance of desired situations, transformations, relationships. Without manipulating them directly physically, although some kinds of physical activity, such as ceremony and or ritual, whether they are formal or informal, may be involved. One can envision very formally by deciding I'm going to sit in this place which is powerful and envision. But then, think about, so when you go to sleep, dreaming tends, for many of us, some of the time, to resemble breathing. It just happens. It's as if it happens to us, and also within us. Now, one can then form intentions around dreaming. For example, the intention to dream about a specific thing, or the intention to, the request that the dreaming aspect helps us better understand a situation or experience a transformation of some kind, or gain what we think of as information about something that's otherwise difficult to know about, as if the dreaming mind has powers that are oracular and transcendentally seeing, and I think it does. The dreaming mind is an array of faculties and also some things we might think of as functions, meaning it does stuff, important stuff, regenerating the organs, cleansing the metabolism, transforming the energetic situation in the body, what we might think of as spiritual energies or soul energies or life energies or electromagnetic, subtle electromagnetic stuff. All of these things the dreaming mind is naturally skillful with. And it does its job, much like our heart and lungs do, without much instruction, but it can also be instructed or skillfully developed, much like our breathing, perhaps like our heart rate, certainly like our habits of thought. So we can have the formal intention to visioneer futures, Um, but I remember when I was younger, the informally visioneering futures, and many of them came to fruition. But there was a mix, right? Like I formally wanted to play the guitar. I formally wanted to be a graphic designer. I formally wanted to publish texts. I formally wanted to be a good fisherman, even though I don't really eat fish. I formally wanted to have an ass like Robert Wagner's. That one sort of came true, which I think is ridiculous. Although now I'm old and it doesn't matter much. I formally wanted to be a secret agent. Now all the things I formally want, I also informally wanted. I'm not sure why I have such a antipathy toward the formalization of certain kinds of things. Perhaps I'm not really concerned about their formalization. I'm concerned about the way that cults utilize formalizations of principles and wisdom to capture and abuse people, to disempower and blind them by giving them the wrapping paper instead of the gift. Yeah, I don't like that. Although sometimes it can be very helpful, and this is hard to understand at first glance. We'd like to have societies and situations that are so fundamentally enlightened that we just climb the ladder together beautifully and successfully toward self-development, mutual development, insight, skillfulness, awareness, wonder, awe, play, joy, humor, eros, all these things. We just climb the ladder together and are constantly lifting each other above positions previous, or at least into harmonious balance where health and vitality and rejuvenation and resurrection are natural features of the situation, right? Of course we all hope for this, but in our actual situation, sometimes it may be useful to fail, right? Talked about this before, the power. Imagine a situation where everything you do succeeds the first time. And so it requires very little effort, and it's going to be extremely difficult to improve, right? To experience a gain in skillfulness or ability or function. In order for that to happen, there has to be the possibility of making mistakes, and perhaps of pain and suffering, confusion, ignorance, all these things. So it can be very useful, at least in theory, to become enamored of a cult. I have. Before. And, we join the cult, we are enchanted by it. It's very compelling because suddenly we have belonging, we have an experience of belonging that can be otherwise quite difficult to in our common modern situations. Worst common denominator talk here, but in our common modern situations it can be very difficult to find coherent groups that are doing something amazing and beautiful to belong with. And so this is part of why, even though education is kind of a disaster, it's also you wouldn't necessarily just want to get rid of schools. Clearly, one might want to mediate, positively mediate and transform the existing institutions. But the schools are very important because they give young people and the teachers and others the experience of belonging together. And so to the cults, and so to the various petals on the strange flower of fandom, right? Musical groups, films, sports teams, also the usually lethally, in more ways than one, motivated military cohorts and such, yes. Belonging. And obviously we get all kinds of pandering around this. Yeah. Social media panders to this desire to belong and delivers, largely counterfeit representations, right? We steal the real thing is stolen, ground up, compromised, essentially destroyed, and then we are sold a broad array of ever less rich and powerful counterfeits. This is the common thing that happens a lot in our modern culture. Now, when we come together with and for each other and we forge intentional social contexts and cohorts, pods, if you will, like a dolphin pod or a primate pod or a whale pod, then we have both a kind of natural immunity to these gambits and the capacity to lift each other out of them, or even to manipulate them from within. This is the covert version of the possibilities of our human sociality. And this can be done in various different kinds of ways. It can be done in rather serious ways, and it can also be done in more or less playful or game-like ways. And these two can actually merge so that you can have playful games that actually transform or ameliorate the ersatz humanity and ersatz community, ersatz spirituality that is so pervasive in our modern experience. it's not the only thing going on. And when we're alone, when we're isolated, it may seem like the entire context is just violations. And this is what leads people to terror, agony, self-harm, suicide, what we think of as madness, which, if you, madness is a fairly natural result of the constant exposure to the kinds of double, triple, quadruple, or, myriad sorts of binds, right, where, that emerge in our experience of the broad array of competing anti-cultures, anti-nations, anti-societies that dominate, corporations that dominate our modern experience and concern. And they are terrible, but they're not the only thing going on. And in order to, it's not just that we discover what's going on when we begin to form intentional communal groups, even if it's only for a short period of time. See, this is the key. We can get escape velocity immediately from all of this in a small group with a shared intention to do so. And we can sustain that over time and give it a heartbeat, and that can even reproduce other little groups that bubble in and prosper even in the counterfeit nightmares that they arise from and perhaps against, and out of the desire to transcend these troubling situations. So there are forms of magic that don't require trades or soul selling and so forth. They're very powerful, and some of them are profoundly virtuous. They are not composed for the sake of vengeance. This is a very dangerous motivation, generally speaking. It leads to a lot of trouble in almost every case. They are not war machines. They are not primarily for personal gain. They may not be entirely selfless, though they can be composed under such circumstances. But they are resistant to capture. By selfish, manipulative, or warlike motivations. And they can also be profoundly protective, healing, calming, nurturing, nourishing. And these forms arise from an ache that I suspect we all come to human incarnation with. And it's an ache for the it's an ache for the positive version of justice, which is the dissolution of injustices and their replacements with virtues. Now again, if once either of these ideas become highly explicit, there's going to be a lot of trouble. Most of the time. If you're explicitly concerned with virtue, this tends to produce irony. If you're explicitly concerned with harm or vengeance or war, you're going to have irony. cleansing, bathing, smudging, naturing, grounding, getting your feet, your bare feet on the surface of the ground. Surrounding, going into nature, going into the living waters of the river or the ocean or the lake or the stream. These are potent and powerful precursors to the formation of the kinds of intentions that naturally become, that naturally influence, without dictating, futures and transformations of situations. I was speaking with someone maybe about a week and a half ago, and I asked him if he had ever prayed, and he said, I don't think I ever really got the impression that something was listening. And that's a very rational response, sensible. Why should we engage in activities whose effectiveness we have no way to determine? Well, that's one perspective. But I wonder if it ever occurred to him that whether or not someone was listening, or something was listening, the transformational effects could be profound either way. They could be profound neither way. They could be profound both ways. They could be profound even if there was no way to understand how or why they were, in fact, profound. Because somehow our behavior transforms our potential. And the fact or fiction of our explanations, in many cases, either doesn't matter or can be very limiting. So, these are things to consider. I heard once that some president, perhaps it was Bush, inaugurated a study of prayer. It's like attempting to study, I don't know, something that cannot be detected by the methods we would ordinarily presume. I heard this morning of an experiment done to establish what's called the Weissman barrier in biology, a feature of biology that is certainly wrong and yet has been canon for a very long time in terms of modern science. And the experiment was absurdly stupid. And yet everyone supposed that it was one of the greatest biological experiments that had ever been done. Well, perhaps not everyone. It was very common to suppose this. So I had people pray for sick people and so on, people who knew them and people who didn't. And apparently the study produced the result that the people who were prayed for were actually slightly less likely to recover than those who were not prayed for. Experiments and rational thought and science are very powerful tools. Their scope, though, is quite limited compared to that which is. Right? You could say that which is the case, but that's different from that which is. Their scope is different from reality. The scope of rational thought is similar in its limitations to the scope of the physical manipulation of objects. Right? I can move hammers all I want. Much of my experience cannot be reasonably affected, cannot be properly transformed or successfully transformed by my manipulation of hammers. And if I should fall under the delusion that my capacity to manipulate hammers is the only way for me to achieve true and valid belief, conceptual or procedural insight, understanding, then I'm going to be in a really bad situation. One imagines someone that is a boatwright but specializes in the formation of the skeletal precursors to the hull, and they think this is the only important thing, the skeletal precursors. You can't have a hull without these. So they only build skeletal, they only build the frame, and the frame doesn't float. And they think that they are an expert and that they know everything about boats because they do the most important thing, which is produce the frame. My presentation of the metaphor was a little sketchy there, but I think you get the idea. This is similar to the overvaluing of rationals, frameworks, models, explanations, theory, experiment, and so on. When we do experiments, we try very desperately to evict most of what's going on from the context so that we can control the resulting context and its variables well enough to acquire deterministic knowledge of cause, effect, futurial transformations. And this is a very compelling method, but it can also be blinding. In tests to determine whether things like telepathy exist, they do, I assure you. I am as sure of telepathy as I am of breathing. Very few, if any, of the experiments took a fundamental feature of telepathy into the experimental context. What is this feature? Intimacy. Deep mutual concern and awareness. Which is naturally productive of various forms of non-ordinary awareness and sensing of the state, needs, thought, concern desires of the other. Natural between mothers who adore their young and newborn children, though it's not merely a matter of the young and the newborns. Natural between dogs and cats and their human companions, probably other pets, natural between certain insects and humans, birds, reptiles even, and so forth. But we hear, well, there's no evidence of, nobody's written a paper about that. There's nothing in the literature. I remember one day I was here at this lake talking with an ornithologist, and I explained that by careful observation, I had determined how to determine the physical gender of geese. The snow geese, white cheeks, the Canadian geese. Canada geese, I think they're called. Which, by the way, I'm pretty sure isn't named after the country. I think it's named after a man whose last name was Canada. I think I heard someone saying this. They might have been having their friend on, but I explained that by careful observation over time, because this is a quest I undertook. I realized the geese can tell for sure each other's gender by sight, right? And if they can tell, we can tell. But in the literature, it is claimed that it cannot be determined. It can be determined by behavior, but not by appearance. And I didn't believe that, so I went on a quest. It took me a few years. It wasn't until I met an old goose couple, an older couple, which is very uncommon in nature because old geese don't survive in nature, but in cities they can. And then in them, the distinctions were highlighted, exaggerated. And so I said to this guy, I was like, there are ways to visually determine the gender of these birds. And he got very upset and literally said, there's nothing in the literature about that. And I was like, how about we just look at some birds together and let's see if we can do it. Nope, it's not in the literature. There's no evidence, right? We hear this all the time. There's no evidence of faith healing, no evidence of God, no evidence of angels, demons. I would argue that Facebook and Google are pretty strong evidence of demons, not to mention, many other bizarre features of our modern world. If you decide to not look for evidence, or if you decide that previous experiments not done by you explain for all eternity what exists, what doesn't, what it does and doesn't do, what it can and cannot do, then you have become theory blinded, right? Because in point of fact, we speak and think as if that which has previously been established is continuous and permanent, when there's no evidence of any permanent thing, and continuity is relative, right? It's not concrete, it's relative. And the nature of time itself can change. The nature of light can change. The nature of perceivers can change, does change. If you're dreaming, you're still perceiving. So it's very important to be able to distinguish between, there might be stuff that's nonsensical in a dangerous way that we should avoid. We should naturally avoid believing it, right? Acting as if it's true. On the other hand, life and thought, our bodies, our relationships as human beings are fundamentally experimental. The fact that there are concrete realities doesn't mean that all previously known exemplars of fact are the concrete foundation of our existence or are reliable guides to futurity. What Nassim Nicholas Taleb calls black swans, which are previously unknown phenomena, happen all the time. The current models of time-space and such are all come from black swans. Totally, no one expected that Einstein was going to come along and go like, I think this distinction between space and time, while seems very obvious and intuitive, is wrong. And then Arkhani Hamed and others of his ilk came along and said, this perspective that time-space is and must be fundamental to all that's going on not only is unlikely, but can't be the case. Black swans come into our awareness and obliterate previously dominant biases. And when they do so, they are usually liberating. We gain new degrees of freedom, insight, wonder, play, ability, function, so on. The findings of science, theory, and experiment are provisional. They will be overturned. It's not they might be overturned, they will be overturned. And so we should recognize that the terrain ahead isn't the ignorant, I'm not even sure what to say. There's a word I'm looking for. The crippling suppositional certitude that, we've already determined what a goose is. And now we know. Well, I doubt it. The fact is, we don't know what anything is. We have highly provisional toys, and when we exchange those for wonder and curiosity, passion and insight, something inside us begins to die. What we have mostly as moderns is not knowledge, it's representation. And representation in language and concept is deceptively powerful. And it is this deception, this... See, here is magic, right? Here is magic. Here is transcendental influence by which we can be captured and manipulated. What we have is something that replaces intimacy with tokens, words, maps, models, hypotheses. Because actual knowledge is intimate like kissing. And if you experience the inflowing and indwelling of this knowledge, it will not be like thinking, it will be like orgasm. It will be like kissing. It will be like death. It will be like birth. Some of you may notice a radical transformation in the vector of my locution or illocution. But yes, science is powerful, but it is not the arbiter of meaning, identity, purpose, value, fact, truth. And we see this kind of refraction away from science in many domains of our modern social experience. The problem with that particular refraction is that some of that is a weaponized psyop. Nations are experimenting with how to kill each other's populations with information. And so we have the mixture of the truth of the danger, for example, of the COVID vaccines, with the intent to deceptively harm populations, right? This is very common, unfortunately, in our modern situation. All my father's life, he thought he knew what a tree was. And then one day at the mirror pool here in this garden near where I'm standing, I accidentally enchanted him. And we sat on this bench where a woman is sitting now. And he began to have what might be described as an emergence event. And he turned to me and he said, "We have to leave. I'm dying. I'm going to become this tree." And he was simultaneously, hello.
How are you?
Nice to see you today.
Nice to see you too.
He was simultaneously alarmed and ecstatic. He had never had an experience like this. Drugs were not involved. He felt he was becoming the tree. And I tried to calm him. I told him it'll be okay, we can leave if we must. He said, "We have to go, we have to leave." And then a squirrel climbed up his leg and up onto his shoulder, and he said, see, even the squirrel knows I am a tree. This is intimacy. And trance can produce the potential for modes of intimacy that thought must extinguish. Speech is very similar. I was talking with someone the other day about their dreaming experience, and who was it? I'm trying to remember. Whoever it was, he said, "I don't think I remember speaking in a dream," and I was wildly unsurprised. I mean, I was partially surprised because most of us think, that's the key word, we think that we have the experience of having conversation, many of us have the memory of an experience resembling conversation in dreaming. And that part's true, it resembles conversation. But as it moves more and more explicitly toward the semblance of speaking, the manifold that supports the dreaming is collapsing. The intimacy is disappearing. One way to end an experience is to speak about it. Think of two people passionately kissing. And one of them then, for whatever bizarre reason of dissociative confusion, decides that the most important thing in this moment is to say something. The speech ends the experience. Language is deceptively weird in that we think it gives us the power to communicate. It does, but primarily in the layer of representations.
Stayed across the Tamale Street from us, and we hung out.
Which is not the same layer as experience, and certainly not the same layer as intimacy. Where in this mess is science? Right? Science is, in our time at least, daimonic. And when I was a child, I wanted to become a scientist because it seemed that these were the people who best knew, who had the most complete knowledge of things being circumstances, origins, futures, and so forth. And machines were very fascinating to me because it was as if in my previous incarnations these things didn't exist and now they do. And they seemed quite impossible. Even a thing like a zipper is impossible. How much more impossible is a thing like a mouse? You know, humans can compose a zipper. They cannot compose a mouse. So you see, this kind of representational knowledge is extremely dangerous because it evicts us from what I would call transcendent participation. And that's where our actual spirit, our capacity to forge purposes beautiful, noble, and true, and to embody and enact them together arises, not from knowledge, from participatory intimacy. You know, we because we are embodied humans, eventually, one way or another, most of us, vast majority of us, have an experience that we call orgasm. And for some of us this happens in childhood, and for others it's in our teens, and for some it might not be even until our adulthood. And there are more life phases than those ones as well. But there are experiences of intimacy that make what we think of as orgasm seem trivial in comparison. And these are modes of intimacy. Everyone's going like, wait, what did he just say? That's not true. No, it's true. You can have, there's a broad array of experiences that are normally, well, they are very successfully inhibited in us moderns. And there's a broad array of similar modes of cognition, the use, the sort of, the reformation or the formation of modes of awareness, consciousness, things that resemble thought and so forth, that are so different from everything we've ever imagined, and yet are natural to our kind of being, our form, our humanity, our animality, our organismality, our beingness. There are modes of intimacy so ecstatic that you would never trade them for an orgasm. And this is part of why we hear some mystics singing the praises of what? The ascetic path. The path of non-indulgence. The path of chastity or temperance. And, you know, dreaming really is very, very profound. And in dreaming, there can be modes of adoration and eros that are vastly beyond what we are inclined to usually experience while awake, or beyond what seems accessible to us while awake in our life phase, in our development. But what I'm trying to get at here is that this thing we call orgasm, it is, in a sense, there's different ways to say this. It's a repercussion of participatory intimacy that can be physically produced. And since our first experiences with it are usually catalyzed by physical sensations, rhythms, rhythmic, pulsing, rubbing, so forth, we should understand that that is a lesser stasis, a lesser exemplar of something for which there is a forest of superpositions above that. And when I was a child and I was fascinated with science, what I didn't realize is that I had no way to understand this. Although some people tried to say something, maybe this is why the problem ensued. There didn't seem to be anyone whose knowledge was deeper than the knowledge of scientists, but the knowledge of the poets, of the mystics, of the philosophers, of the adoring ones. This knowledge makes the powers of science shrivel. Oh, they are still mechanically powerful and may in fact snuff our planet and our people. Yes, they are physically very powerful, but where is the intimacy? It is that participatory intimacy that we hunger for. And when we hope not for justice, but for the diminution, the transformative composting of injustices, it is this participatory intimacy that we know, we sense would thereafter obtain. And become the water, the many forms of waters in which our hearts and histories and futures could then swim. We poor moderns have named nearly everything and thus evicted all the named features and beings and relationships and situations from much of our experience, if not all of it. Yeah. We have representational knowledge. Miles deep. How tragic for us. That is the Alexandrian library of the skeletal remains of what might have been understanding and insight medicinal awareness, transformative, ecstatic participation, magic, wonder, play, awe, virtue. I'm walking in the botanical gardens here, and even though this is a place curated by my extremely confused at the group level species, the living beings here, they form a manifold over the strange dead inside evictions that otherwise prevail as cities and roads and shops and buildings and so forth. And they are ecstatic. If we could change our way of being in time, this ecstasy would flow into and through and around and between all the aspects of our being in such a way as to draw us into transcendent visionary awareness. And I don't say this because I know it. This isn't knowledge. I'm on the verge of experience. Yes, I'm on the verge of the experience of what I hear suggest. We are not distinct in the ways our common thought suppose or create. And there are games afoot, there are missions here, so beautiful that the entire history of language and knowledge has nothing to do with them. There's no thing you can formally know that's more interesting than the kiss of your beloved, the flavor of that food grown by your grandmother in her garden on endless afternoons, as she toiled to make the foods the families would consume together. Mostly in distracted confusion. Especially once the invention of televisions began to become dominant. And think for a moment of what the television is replacing. Yep. There's a reason that thing is so compelling, was so compelling. There's a reason why we have these screens. They are counterfeiting something, and if you think just a little bit, you will see what they are counterfeiting, and what it is something resembling group dreaming, group telepathy, organized group missioneering, organized group anamnesis. And this is what we must reach for together if we are to retrieve the faculties, the ecstasies, the beauty of our origins and natures and potentials. And that's a mission I adore and do believe in. And if my humble speaking can contribute, then I will have lived this day in a way worthy of my ancestors and their dreams, my progeny and their dreams. Which dreams must not be euthanized by thought and language, machine, modernity, war, prisoneering, commerce, tokenization, representation, eviction. ferns here. I've always loved the forms of the plants. The insects are impossible. The animals, the organisms on this world are fundamentally impossible. If we could take off the staggering burdens of representational cognition, ecstasy would naturally arise because we ourselves are and are surrounded by infinite manifolds of impossibly beautiful wonder, organism. Origin, spirit, purpose, the superposition from which the concept of beauty is derived, the living bubble of being, history and future and purpose. That naturally imbues up from the soil and down from the sky, like trees and rain. Ecstatic, originary, true, vital. Oh, how I adore these organisms, and how confused I mostly am. When deprived of that fundamental participatory intimacy, which is true recognition and explosive anamnesis. Thank you for joining me. I'm so grateful to have this time. Take a moment to like or comment or ask a question or share something personal. In this way you will help my humble efforts reach more people. May your ways be beautiful, your hearts be light, and your relationships exquisite. Thank you for joining me. I look forward to learning together again very soon. Bye-bye for now.